Okay, so today we're going deep on something pretty wild. And I gotta say, even for this show, this one's pushing the boundaries. We're talking about the idea of changing your race, like literally altering your physical appearance to align with a different racial identity.
Yeah. It's right at that crossroads where identity meets technology. We've got cosmetic surgery already playing a huge role. And then you layer on the potential of gene editing, and it gets really complicated really fast.
No kidding, but luckily, that's what we're here for, right? Break it down, make sense of it all. And we've got some, let's just say, interesting sources to dive into today. Reddit threads, YouTube videos, even some academic papers. Real mixed bag.
And for our listener who's trying to keep up with all this without getting a PhD in bioethics, we've pulled out the key points. We'll be hitting the idea of transracialism, which, trust me, is a whole thing. And we'll look at how people are already using cosmetic surgery to try to make these changes. Then we'll touch on gene editing, which is like the next level sci-fi stuff. But the big question, the one we're really going to wrestle with today, is the ethics of all of this. Like, just because we can do something, does that mean we should?
That's the million-dollar question, or maybe billion-dollar question at this
Yeah.
point. So how about we kick things off with this whole transracialism concept? I mean, it's been in the news, right? We got people like Rachel Dolezal, Shaw King, who were basically saying they identify as a different race than they were born into. And people kind of lost their minds.
Yeah. Yeah, I remember all that. And you see it even in the Simon Cushing video we've got here. A lot of pushback, a lot of people saying it's just not possible. But the thing is, there's this argument, and it pops up in a few of these sources, that race is actually, like, at least in part, a social construct, kind of like
Yeah.
gender, right?
Right. So the Wikipedia article on ethnicity and this What is Race video, they both talk about how these categories are defined by societies. So the argument is, if these are human ideas, then maybe they're not as fixed and unchanging as we think.
Right. And just so we're clear for our listener, it's not saying there are no biological differences between, say, different groups of people. It's more that the way we've lumped folks into these racial categories, well, it's based on history, culture, all this stuff that humans have decided on, not necessarily pure biology. In fact, the In Defense of Transracialism RCTA video, they go hard on the idea that science is kind of moving away from using biology to define race.
Huh, interesting. And actually, the Wikipedia entry on race, the one specifically about human categorization, it actually walks through that history. Like, it shows how race went from these early attempts at, like, sorting people by biology to the categories we use now. And the crazy part is, it even talks about how scientists are still arguing over whether biological races even exist.
See, this is what I love about this stuff. It gets you thinking, right? And this whole social construct versus biology thing, well, it gets even more interesting when you think about why someone might identify as transracial in the first place.
Right.
I mean, if it's all just social, then why go through all this? But our sources, like that RCTA video and the transracial identity study, they point to a real desire to match how you look on the outside with how you feel on the inside, to align your physical appearance with your sense of racial identity.
So it's not just playing dress up, right? I mean, the biracial community of Reddit, that thread has this one person who felt really drawn to Japanese culture from a young age. And by adopting certain looks, clothes, hair, makeup, they actually felt like they found a place where they belonged. Like their inside finally matched their outside.
And that's a really powerful human need, right? To feel like who you are is reflected in how you present yourself to the world. And so the question for you to chew on is this. If someone feels a strong, consistent connection to a different race than the one they were assigned at birth, is it really just about social stuff, or is there something deeper going on? The RCTA video definitely leans into the whole freedom to choose your identity thing, kind of like how we've become more accepting of transgender folks.
But, you can't ignore the other side of this, like that black to white transracials thread. That showed how sometimes these motivations can be way more complex. Like sometimes it's rooted in stuff like internalized racism or past trauma. It's not always this straightforward, happy-go-lucky, finding yourself story.
Yeah, for sure. It's messy and it's personal. So we've got this desire for alignment, right? But how do people actually make these changes? Well, cosmetic surgery is the obvious one. Like the RCTA video mentioned Ollie London, who had all those surgeries to look Korean. And then there's Martina Big, who's in that, quote, Goats podcast transcript. She did lip injections, a nose job, even skin darkening treatments to try to get a black look, which, wow, that's intense.
It makes you wonder how far someone's willing to go, right? But one thing our sources kept saying is that, well, surgery can only take you so far. The RCTA video even said you can't really change things like skull structure. And that transracial identity study basically said that some people feel like a full physical transition is impossible.
And that's where the ethical stuff gets really tricky. Like that RCTA, understanding RCTA document, it brought up this idea that maybe some of these surgeries are driven by like societal beauty standards, like are people actually trying to be authentic or are they just buying into what society says is beautiful for a particular race?
So it's like, what even is race then? If it's not just how you look, then changing how you look is only part of the story. It's not the whole lived experience, right?
Exactly. And that brings us to the really futuristic stuff. Gene editing. The Wikipedia page for it talks about technologies like Talon and Mage, which are basically tools that can make super precise changes to your DNA.
So like, theoretically, if you understand the genes that code for, say, skin color or hair texture, then boom, you could just tweak those genes and change those traits. Sounds like we're straight up in a sci-fi movie now.
Pretty much. But, and this is a big but, the ethics here are, well, they're a minefield. That Wikipedia page even says there are huge debates about gene editing for, like, enhancing humans and the potential for, well, for things to go really wrong. And if you think about what that RCTA document was saying, using gene editing for racial change without understanding the culture behind it, well, that could be like the ultimate form of cultural appropriation.
And then there's the whole historical context too, right? Like that Jeremy Morse video about racism in science. It's a good reminder that people have used science to justify some seriously messed up stuff. So, yeah, got to be careful that we don't repeat those mistakes.
Very real. And the Simon Cushing video, it brings up another point. This idea that racial oppression is like passed down through generations. So if someone changes their race with technology, what does that mean for their connection to that history? Can you just erase that lived experience?
It's complicated, right? But there's this article, let me see. Yeah, https.philarchive.org or Kharkiv Tuvido. And it kind of throws a wrench in things. It says that the problem of privilege is like separate from the whole transracial thing.
Yeah.
And that if we were to say, okay, changing your race is cool, then everyone should have the same access to the technology. It makes you think about whether the act of changing your race is the problem, or is it more about the power structures and inequality that already exist in society?
So big picture time. What are the ethical red flags we need to be watching out for? Our sources bring up a bunch of arguments against transracialism, like that lack of lived experience, like we were talking about, and the potential for people to just have a surface level understanding of a culture, without the real depth. Both the Cushing video and the RCTA video touch on that.
Yeah, like, can you really understand what it means to be part of a racial group that's been historically marginalized if you haven't actually lived that experience? And is it even fair to reduce a whole culture to just a set of physical features? These are big questions.
No doubt. But then you've got the RCTA video coming in with the whole individual freedom angle. Like, they're basically saying, let people choose their identity as long as they're not hurting anyone. It's a very live and let live kind of approach.
And that article, the one comparing transgender and transracial identities, it's interesting because it talks about how we've gotten better at understanding that gender and biological sex aren't the same thing. So there's more room for transgender folks to express their identity. But with race, it's not quite there yet.
It's like we're still figuring out the rules of the game while the game is being played. And this whole idea of being able to change your race, well, it forces us to face some really fundamental questions, like what does it even mean to belong to a race? And how do we define race if it becomes something you can just change?
So we've gone deep on cosmetic surgery, gene editing, the whole concept of changing your race, and, well, my brain's kind of fried. We talked about how race is seen by many as a social construct, why people might want to identify as transracial, the limits of surgery, and the ethical Pandora's box that gene editing opens up.
And as you've heard, there are a lot of different opinions out there. Some people are all for it, some are totally against it, and a lot of folks are somewhere in between. It's a reflection of the bigger conversations we're having as a society about identity and belonging.
It's definitely a lot to think about. Like, what happens when we have the power to change our bodies in such a fundamental way? How does that affect how we see ourselves, how we see each other? It's like we're redrawing the lines of identity, and not just for race, but for everything. So as technology keeps advancing, how do we make sure we're using it ethically and responsibly? It's a question that doesn't really have an easy answer, and it's one that we're all going to have to grapple with sooner rather than later, I think.